if I were to draw a graph here where the horizontal is time, and think of leadership challenges from this perspective of the 1G, 2G, and 3G, and why those three generations is the distinctions that matter, because when you get to the 3G, that's really the setup for being a new kind of 1G. And then there's a subsequent generation, and then another subsequent third generation, right? So what I found is that in the early part of Singapore's success, they went from pretty much nothing, right, to a great deal of success in that first generation. And I would say that first generation can be characterized from a place of inherent or natural wholeness. Because when you're starting out, you are simply trying to make something work and create something out of virtually nothing, right? You become very resourceful and do things, whatever it takes, to get to that level of success, because you are this generation that are the true pioneer leaders. And it requires a certain set of skills and capabilities and leadership qualities to do that, and certain things to accomplish, right? To build that success in the first generation. But then when you get to a certain level of success, you can't continue to operate in that mode. And I remember in those times, this was in the late 90s, so about the 2000s, some of you remember the dot-com bubble and these dot-com companies, where in the beginning they were very dismissive of the large companies, right, having their bureaucratic organizations and all the management layers and all of that. But funny thing happened as those startups reached exceeded 50 employees to 100 employees and 200 employees. What do they have to do? They went and hired people from the same old big firms that they used to be critical, because you couldn't continue at this way of operating. So they, in order to reach this level of success, you needed, and again, I term here as, to make a distinction, manager leaders. And you know the difference we talk about, you know, between managing and leading. They're not one superior and then the other, but they are different and distinct in the way one is at the forefront versus one is in the back. And so in this second generation of leadership, what you need is a different set of skills and different kind of leadership, right? The ones that know how to actually build systems, policies, structures, infrastructures, who understands that you have to get more and more things done through people and managing them rather than doing it directly, right? So, and that you have to build bureaucracies, organizational structures to do that. And so this is characterized by a period of differentiation. And this is where you see that we can't just everyone do everything. We have to have functions, we have to specialize, we have to create certain processes so that they are done consistently rather than just creating them on the spot, which was exactly what was needed in the first generation. Right? And this is where, when I entered in working with Singapore in 1995, they were at the really the pinnacle of success of the second generation leadership. I think everyone knows the story of going from virtually nothing to the first world level of certainly economic success that it achieved. Now it was at this inflection point of what to do, right? Where do we go from here, and what's going to be the best strategy forward? And that's the dangerous part, because here everything in the system is telling you you are succeeding. So you should continue doing what you're doing, right? Because if you do anything else, chances are you're going to meet with less success than you are already succeeding in right here. So that becomes the dilemma. The leadership imperative. So pioneer leaders, right? Key leadership imperative is survival, urgent buildup of basic capabilities, identify initial leaders. Key accomplishments will be clear structure for basic service capabilities, build on leadership of a few key people. The key leadership quality required is often to be a maverick, courage, and individual initiative, risk-taking, just do it attitude. Then the second generation manager leaders, their key leadership imperative is going to be systematizing, go beyond the basics, efficiency and effectiveness of systems and processes, scale up to mass production. Key accomplishment will be to reinvest in the talent, expand leadership, build systems and infrastructure, adapt technology, differentiate, specialize, etc. And what leadership requires is often that transactional leadership, more systems-oriented, technocratic skills, multi-level organizational navigational skills, political skills, and establishing tangible, measurable results. So then we're left with, and we think about that industrial revolution success, the first generation, second generation, third generation, these are the multiple possible pathways, right, going forward from here. You hope to continue to grow in success, but that's not a given. You could end up stagnating and just going, not getting any better, but not getting any worse. Or you could uncover a slow decline or a rapid collapse. So those are really the four possible modalities for the future, right? There's no other possibility other than those four. And the question is, what leads one to be in one or the other? And that's the third generation leadership challenge, right? When I look at what happens to organizations is, let's take this one. This is often, I think, one of the primary ones, right? Where you end up with this oscillation where you don't go anywhere. You don't grow, but you don't fall apart, but you don't really move anywhere. And the reason here is because you have ended up with another generation of manager leaders. And these manager leaders have seen that their job is to do something and make it better within a fixed boundary of what they already have, right? They say, oh, I know what the system is now, and my job is to make it more efficient, right, more productive. And so I start to manage within fixed boundaries. And what that can lead to, I believe, is stagnation. And the reason is that managing within the fixed boundary could be a good strategy if the external rate of change is no faster than your internal rate of change in the organization. But to the extent that it exceeds you and you stay fixed, this is where it leads to stagnation. I think there are situations where companies have thought that, and what happens, the danger, of course, is the stagnation is the first step, a symptom towards eventual collapse or eventual failure, right? So they first, instead of continuing to grow and innovate, they stagnate and then slowly decline, and then sometimes more rapidly decline. Then what happens is that if you go from a generation of manager leaders who have still rubbed shoulders with the second generation of managers who in turn had worked very closely with the first generation, you see it begin to become further and further removed from the core of the essence of this entity, this organization. So what can happen is that from manager leader, and I'll just draw it, this could be really successive generations. I'm going to draw it all over here, is that this one can then become an operator leader. And an operator leader is one that takes the boundary and fixes it around their unit and says, this is my unit, and my job is to optimize my own unit. And if I do that, I believe I'm contributing to the larger success of the organization. And that could be true if you were indeed a completely standalone unit, but that's rarely the case. So when that happens, what you end up with is fragmentation. Right? So everyone optimizing their part actually contributes to global sub-optimization of the larger system. That's one of the system's axioms. Optimizing parts not just produces suboptimal outcomes for the larger system, it virtually guarantees it. One of the best examples of this, of course, was IBM. In the 1980s, who would have thought the biggest, most powerful computer company in the world would be on the verge of bankruptcy? But when you look into what had happened to IBM up to that point, I would argue that it suffered from fragmentation. There's a great book by the CEO who came and helped turn it around, Lou Gerstner, called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? And what's amazing is that he effected the turnaround of that company by coming in alone. Unlike what somebody else would do, right? You say, okay, these are all the bad people. These are the ones that were here that drove it to the ground, so they're out, and bring in his people. He didn't do that. He came in alone, and he brought IBM back from the brink because he was able to help, he said, basically help IBM realize the greatness that was still within them, in the people themselves. And when he left, one of the former VPs became the next CEO, right? And we all know how successful they have become since then. So here you have fragmentation because when he wrote about the situation at IBM, he said when he came in, they had no idea how profitable anything was as a whole company. They had over 120 general ledger systems. That's the fragmentation, right? They said their HR systems were so rigid that if one division wanted to hire somebody from another division, they literally had to fire that person. And then they had to rehire them. They had, I forget how many, certainly dozens and dozens of people with CIO on their title. Now think about that. Chief Information Officer. If you got like 30, 40 chief information officers, how many different information systems are you going to have? One or many? So they really could have gone and fallen apart, right? But they didn't. And I think a lot of credit goes to Gerstner because when he went and talked to customers, what the customers kept coming back to him saying, please do not break up IBM into tiny parts. Please keep it whole. We do not need another disk manufacturer. We do not need another printer manufacturer. We do not need all these different things that they were going to be chopped up. And all these merger and acquisition firms were just chopping at the bit for the millions of dollars they were going to make. But they said, we need somebody with one enterprise system, the wholeness, which is what the third generation challenge is about, right? So that's the story of coming from the brink and succeeding. But the third and unfortunate possibility is this last one. And it can be a slow migration or it can be a quick one. And this last one is the parasite leader. When I first started using that term, people were very squeamish, like, oh, do you have to use that word? But I said, you know what? Parasites are no different than any other animal, right, in the world. They are trying to survive and live. And they happen to pick the particular strategy for doing that, right? Which is what we refer to as parasite. But a parasite in an organization, my definition is this. It's a person who pursues their own individual self-interest above that of the organization that they voluntarily join. Their self-interest above. Now, we all have self-interest. But hopefully we have joined this other organization because they're in a way congruent, And whatever I do, I'm in service of that larger interest first and see how my self-interest fits in. But when that gets flipped, you have a parasite. And when that person is at higher and higher levels of the organization, you have a very dangerous situation where the health of that organization is at peril, right? Just imagine a parasitic infection occurring at the highest levels of the functioning of the organization. And so this, to me, is then the definition of what happens is corruption. It's the definition is a person who puts their self-interest above that of the organization that they voluntarily join. And the most striking example I've run across in my years, not personally, although I worked with the company and I could see it at the time as it was happening. I could also see it in their practices, did not expect it to get as bad as it did. And that is Arthur Andersen, right? The global accounting firm. Some of you may have worked with them in the years past, and some of you may remember them at least. They're long gone now, but it happened very quickly once the rot was discovered, because the rot was at the very top of the organization. It was at the managing partners level of that organization. And so in that case, the decline or collapse happened, I think, in a matter of months. This is an organization that at its peak had over 100,000 employees across the globe in multiple countries, right? And they collapsed so fast. Why? Because there were too many people at the top serving their self-interest. And so those are the pathways that can happen, and it can happen one after the other, right? So you go from manager leader to operator leader, then it's a step to parasite leader. Now, the good news I tell people is that I think Arthur Andersen, and at that time there was Tyco and Global Crossing and number of organizations that suffered from the parasites at the top. However, that is still, I think, the minority, right? Not the rule. So the vast majority of times when we have what I consider parasite leaders or parasite individuals, it's not an intentional one. They're more incidental or accidental. It's because the environment in which they live in and they work in itself has become either permissive or less focused. And so they just look around and say, well, everyone else is doing it, so I might as well too. So it's up to the leadership to rewrite the ship. So that was the case with IBM, right? The people were not bad, and yet they were driven to bankruptcy. So Gerstner helped them reconnect and refocus so that they could resume their success from the past. So the challenge here is really, and this is where I refer to the third generation leader, needs to be this transformational leader, right? If you want to continue that success from the second generation. And I use the word transformational because you can't just do more of what you did in the second generation success. Right? This is the problem or the challenge that faces highly successful organizations. Right? So as a country, this is where Singapore was. They clearly want to continue there, but they struggle. Why? Because the pull of the past success is so powerful. Right? And so I've seen that struggle, and that's why I've worked with so many of the ministries and staff boards there, is because they are sincere in their desire to transform beyond the current success. I believe what's happened in Japan for the last couple of decades, it's never recovered from that collapse in the Nikkei index at a time when Japan Inc. was on the Time cover magazine. It looked like it was going to take over the world in a success as it met its trajectory. And then it wasn't quite able to transform and break out. Doesn't collapse, but it has not yet been able to fully transform. A lot of historical and industry reasons that I've read about that could explain it. But Singapore, as a small, nimble country, is working towards this trajectory, right? And so that's the transformational. So down here, I said you got to go from the wholeness, the differentiation, to transformation, and that may often require the integration of what has been too fragmented. Fragmentation, one way to see it is this another cartoon here, right? The people on the boat, I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end while it's sinking on one end. And of course, in this cartoon, it's kind of humorous because the boat's small and you can actually see this. But imagine this is a huge, ocean liner or cruise ship. You can't see it, but the attitude is still there, right? This is what happens in large organizations. They get fragmented. They just think, oh, I'm fine, I'm successful, and it's not my problem. That's what Gershner found at IBM. Different divisions were reporting their successes even as the company was going bankrupt. So if I go back to the slides, so from there to stagnation to fragmentation, from the fixed boundaries to the shrinking boundaries. So from that fragmentation, the parasites, collapsing boundaries to the individual, that leads to an outcome which is the corruption. I believe is needed is this kind of rhythm, right? The leaders, managers, manager. You need to, pioneer leaders, break and path and grow. And then you need a time of consolidation and to scale up whatever that last success was. But then you need to go back and look at leading again, right? To new areas, to innovate, rather than trying to continue to just milk the success of that last piece. But then you need to go and consolidate it again. In other words, if you put leader back to back, there's a danger of just burning out the organization. So that was my conclusion, is that there is a healthy cycle of this kind of leader manager rhythm, if you will, to it. So the 3G, third generation leadership questions I often ask is, where is your organization or community in its own leader manager cycle? And what is the nature of that third generation leadership challenge for your organization or community at this point in its history?